Welcome to the deep dive. Okay, so today we've got this fascinating question we're going to unpack using this stack of sources you sent us, articles, research, notes.
It's all about geography, isn't it? And
Yeah.
how much it actually still shapes our world.
Exactly. Because there's this idea, maybe from the 90s, that technology, the internet, globalization,
Yeah.
it just flattened everything, made the physical map less important.
Right. But these sources, well, they paint a pretty different picture. We see mountains stopping armies, coastlines shaping trade, deserts limiting empires.
So our mission today is to really get into this material, pull out the key ideas, and see what insights we can find about the enduring power of the map. We'll look at places like Iraq, the Middle East, even the U.S.-Mexico border.
Places where you might think politics or economics are the whole story, but geography keeps popping up.
So the big question, has technology really conquered geography? Or does the physical world, the actual earth and stone, still fundamentally call the shots? Let's dive in. So where do we start? The sources kick off with some really vivid anecdotes, don't they? Things that just hit you.
Yeah, like that story from northern Iraq back in '86. You're deep inside Saddam Hussein's Iraq, this totalitarian state.
And the Kurdish driver points out the difference. Arabistan, the flat plain.
And then Kurdistan, the mountains. And instantly, it's like a switch flips.
On the map, it's all Iraq. Saddam's supposed to be in total control.
But the source says, as soon as they hit those mountains, Saddam's soldiers, the propaganda posters, all signs of his regime, they just vanished.
Wow. Like the mountains themselves just said, no further.
It's a stark illustration. The landscape imposed a boundary that the political map ignored.
And it's not just that one example. There's the bit about crossing the Carpathians.
Right, they're not like completely impassable, not like the Himalayas or something.
But the source describes a definite gradation. You feel the landscape changing as you move east, hinting at those vast plains beyond.
Or that description of the Turkmenistan coast after crossing the Caspian Sea. Stark, abstract, clay-colored, just bam. You're somewhere fundamentally different.
So these aren't just travel stories. They're getting at something deeper.
Exactly. The core argument running through all this material is that geography isn't passive. It's an active force. It shapes politics, it shapes conflict, it even shapes, the stories nations tell about themselves.
And what's really interesting is how this works even with technology. The Middle East uprisings are a key example in the sources.
Definitely. Satellite TV, social media, they absolutely connected protesters. Tunisia inspired people in Egypt, Yemen, Bahrain. Technology built that shared feeling, that common cause across borders.
A virtual community.
Yes, but then when it came to actually trying to change things politically, the sources argue that each country's path was massively influenced by its own specific deep history and its unique geography.
Tunisia itself is a great case study for this.
It really is. Geographically, it's distinct. It juts right out into the Mediterranean, closer to Sicily than anywhere else in North Africa. Historically, it's been this concentrated zone of settlement, of civilization.
Different from, say, the geography of Algeria or Libya, which the sources describe as sort of vaster, maybe less defined historically.
Exactly. Tunisia has this long, coherent identity tied to its place, and that incredible detail about the Fossa Regia.
This Roman ditch from 202 BC.
Yeah, marking the line between settled Roman territory and the nomadic areas. And the sources point out that even today, centuries later, that ancient line roughly correlates with differences. Fewer Roman ruins beyond it, maybe stronger tribal identities persisting.
It's almost unbelievable how an ancient geographical feature can still echo in modern life, pushing back against all the things we think unify us now.
It really challenges that post-Cold War optimism, doesn't it? That feeling in the 90s that, democracy would just spread easily, globalization was inevitable, human divisions were just temporary.
That view kind of forgot about the mountains and rivers, didn't it?
It underestimated their persistence. Look at the Balkans example in the material, those rugged mountain ranges, the historical fault lines from the Ottoman and Byzantine empires.
They correlate with different experiences, right? Lower living standards, different paths under communism compared to the areas that were part of the Habsburg or Prussian spheres.
Yeah, the source mentioning traveling from Hungary, which was relatively liberal, into Ceausescu's Romania in the 80s. A tangible geographical shift, things getting demonstrably worse as you moved east into that different historical geographical zone.
Okay, so let's crystallize this. The first big idea from these sources, really, is that geography is not just a stage, it's an active player.
Right. It's a persistent force. Mountains, plains, coastlines, where the place is relative to others. All this influences stability, conflict, history itself. It pushes back against our plans, our borders, our technology sometimes. It sets limits and creates possibilities.
Okay, so building on that, let's talk about how different kinds of geography present different kinds of challenges and how that shapes societies. Africa comes up as a major example in the sources.
Yeah, and it's quite a sobering one. The material points to several geographic factors that have, historically at least, contributed to challenges like poverty.
Like what specifically?
Well, south of the Sahara, you have a relatively smooth coastline compared to, say, Europe, fewer good natural harbors. Major rivers often aren't navigable very far inland because they drop steeply from the interior plateau.
So getting goods or people in and out is harder.
Historically, yes. Then there's the Sahara itself, a huge barrier limiting contact with the Mediterranean world for centuries. And near the equator, dense forests. Challenging for large-scale farming, difficult to move through, making state building harder in some ways.
These aren't destiny, the sources stress that, but they are significant hurdles that played a role in isolation and later made those imposed colonial borders feel even more artificial because they didn't map onto the existing physical or human landscape.
Now, flip that and look at Europe, as the sources do. It's almost the opposite geographical picture.
Highly indented coastline, loads of natural harbors.
Exactly. Navigable rivers reaching deep inland across fertile plains. Resources like coal and iron often found near water transport. And the climate, moderated by the Gulf Stream, generally good for agriculture.
It makes you think about that Toynbee quote mentioned in the sources. Ease is inimical to civilization.
Right, the idea isn't that Europe was easy living. Far from it. But maybe its geography offered a kind of manageable difficulty. Challenging enough to spur innovation, but with enough connection points, rivers, seas to allow trade, interaction, the spread of ideas.
Even England's island status is mentioned as helping forge a unified nation early on, a geographical advantage.
And this connection between geography and development, or power, is right at the heart of classic geopolitical thinking.
Like Mackinder in the Heartland.
Absolutely. He looked at that massive Eurasian interior, unreachable by sea power, later linked by rail, and called it the pivot region.
Control the heartland, control the world island, control the world. That was the gist, right?
Pretty much. And you can see how that idea seemed relevant in the 20th century.
Yeah.
Germany driving east, the Soviets dominating Eastern Europe, the western edge of that heartland. Even the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan.
Part of the heartland driven by that old Russian desire for warm water ports, which the sources link to their eventual downfall.
And today, Russia, even without the Soviet Empire, is still often analyzed through this lens, that geographical insecurity driving it to control its near abroad, those buffer states.
Then you've got the opposite view, in a way. Mahan and sea power.
Yeah, the sea is the great highway. Naval dominance equals global dominance. Less threatening, perhaps, because ships project power differently than land armies.
Influenced massive naval buildups.
It did, though the sources also bring in Corbett's nuance, the fleet in being. Maybe you don't need total dominance, but strategic presence, controlling choke points, using bases effectively, something the U.S. Navy is apparently thinking more about now.
And Spikeman focusing on the Rimland.
Right, those coastal areas around Eurasia. He argued they were actually more important than the heartland because that's where sea power and land power meet and clash. He also talked about America's unique geographical position, protected by oceans.
So these are the classic ideas, but then there's a more modern take mentioned, Bracken's crisis of room.
Yeah, this is really interesting. He argues technology hasn't made geography irrelevant, it's just collapsed the distance, filled up the empty spaces. The world feels smaller, more crowded.
So geography as a buffer, as a safety zone, that's eroding.
That's the idea. Distance and difficult terrain used to provide some insulation. Now, with advanced weapons, proliferation, the finite size of the Earth itself becomes a problem. He points to that build of countries with WMDs from Israel to North Korea. Asia, especially, is becoming like one interconnected, volatile strategic space, a shrinking chessboard.
Okay, so pulling this section together. Geographical features aren't just scenery. They're deeply tied to how civilizations develop, the challenges they face, and how we think about global power.
Precisely. Whether it's controlling the heartland, the rimland, or the sea lanes, the struggle for power has often been understood geographically. And even though technology changes the game, it's still played out on this physical Earth, which feels increasingly crowded.
Right, let's get even more specific now and look at how these geographical forces are playing out in current events, using examples straight from the sources. The Middle East is obviously key. The material highlights three main geographical features there.
Yes, the Arabian Peninsula, the Iranian Plateau, and the Anatolian land bridge, which is essentially Turkey.
Saudi Arabia, on the peninsula, its power comes from oil and gas, obviously tied to its geology.
But its geography is also a source of major vulnerability. Water scarcity is huge, a massive youth population straining resources. And that long, porous border with Yemen tribal mountain is incredibly hard to control.
And even internal divisions, like Hijaz versus Najd, have geographical roots mentioned in the sources.
Definitely. Then Iran, on its plateau, its large population is an asset, and its geography, being a relatively coherent plateau, is seen as contributing to its strong state tradition, a gift of spatial coherence, as one source puts it. Its location is also strategic, south of the traditional heartland, inside the rimland.
The sources also mention its Shiism being intertwined with that state tradition, and its future path is seen as critical for the whole region.
Interestingly, though, the material notes that despite cultural and historical links, Iran's influence in post-Soviet Central Asia hasn't been as dominant as you might expect, perhaps partly due to the physical difficulty of projecting power northwards across that terrain, a geographical constraint.
Then Turkey, the Anatolian land bridge, historically looking west towards Europe with its main population and industry there.
But its geography as a land bridge is fundamental. It's been shaped by migrations for millennia. Now we see its rise as a middle power, increasingly looking towards the Middle East too. Its pivotal location defines its options.
The sources even touch on Turkish Islam, maybe being more compatible with democracy, and Turkey now balancing or competing with Iran despite being in NATO.
And ironically, the communications tech that connects protesters also connects Turks, Iranians, Arabs on a religious level,
Yeah.
as Muslims, adding another layer.
Okay, now Iraq, Mesopotamia. The sources paint a pretty bleak picture linked to its geography.
Tragically so, yes.
Hmm.
Described as a natural frontier zone, a river valley constantly fought over, rarely unified demographically.
So the argument is the modern state, created by the British, mashed together these disparate groups in this contested space.
And it basically required intense authoritarian rule like Saddam's just to hold it together. Remove that lid, and it fragments along those old geographical and sectarian lines. Geography as a burden, almost.
Syria, too, another crisis zone where geography looms large.
The sources link its instability directly to its fragmented geography. Differences between major cities like Aleppo and Damascus, distinct regions associated with different ethnic and sectarian groups.
Again, the idea that maybe only authoritarianism could bind such a place.
That's suggested. But there's also a glimmer of hope mentioned, citing the poet Ali Ahmad Said. Syria's position at the heart of the Levant, its Mediterranean connection, could potentially offer a basis for a more cosmopolitan identity, drawing strength from its geography in a different way.
Let's look at Russia. Vast land power. But the sources emphasize the vulnerability.
That huge, flat expanse, lack of natural borders, especially to the west, this breeds a deep historical insecurity.
Which drives expansionism, pushing outwards to find defensible lines, create buffer zones.
That's the classic geopolitical interpretation presented, pushing west, south into the Caucasus east. And this geographical reality favored centralized authoritarian rule historically just to manage such a vast, exposed territory.
And post-Soviet Russia is still driven by this, the sources argue, controlling the near abroad.
The geographical imperative persists according to this view.
Finally, the U.S.-Mexico border. This hits closer to home for many. The sources see the blurring of this line as fundamentally geographical.
Yeah, it's a frontier between vastly different levels of development. They bring in Toynbee again. When the advanced society stops advancing, the less developed one often gains ground over time, culturally, demographically.
You see northern Mexico becoming economically and culturally intertwined with the U.S. Southwest, a geographical reality.
And the geography of the border region itself, those rugged, hard-to-control areas, contributes to the rise of cartels operating across that space. The lawless frontier tradition meets modern crime.
So it clashes with ideas like Huntington's about maintaining a sharply distinct American identity. Geography and demographics are pushing towards some kind of integration or cosmopolitanism along that border, the sources suggest.
Okay, so the third key takeaway here is crystal clear. Right. Specific regional geographies matter immensely.
They shape everything from internal politics and stability to foreign relations and conflict. To understand what's happening in the Middle East or Russia or along borders, you have to factor in the underlying physical landscape. It's crucial context. So we've seen geography as this powerful shaping force, but the sources are also careful not to fall into pure determinism, right? Human choice still matters.
Absolutely. There's that important warning, referencing Isaiah Berlin, calling geographical determinism potentially immoral and cowardly.
Immoral because it lets people off the hook for their choices, blaming the landscape instead.
Exactly. And cowardly because it avoids taking individual responsibility. The map is the starting point, not the final answer. Human decisions, ideas, leadership, they all interact with geography.
And Brunel's point fits here too. We're not totally free agents. We operate within geographical limits.
But knowing those limits, being aware of geography's influence, actually gives us more agency, more power to act effectively within those constraints. Ignorance makes us victims of geography. Awareness helps us navigate it.
Which is crucial for grand strategy, as the sources call it. They use Rome's decline as an example.
Right. Rome failed, in part because its strategy didn't adapt to the changing geographical and political realities beyond its frontiers, new peoples, new power centers forming in places like Northern Europe. They didn't understand or react effectively to the shifting map.
And the parallel is drawn to the U.S. today, facing challenges of overstretch, needing a strategy that's realistic, aware of global geographical realities, using diplomacy and force wisely, not just assuming power works the same everywhere.
It underlines the need for geographical literacy in foreign policy.
Okay, so this leads us to our fourth and final key takeaway from this deep dive. While geography is incredibly powerful and persistent, setting contours and influencing events, it is not destiny.
Human agency, choices, ideas, they interact with the physical world in complex ways. But understanding geography's influence is key to making better choices, whether you're a policymaker or just trying to make sense of the world. It helps avoid surprises and costly mistakes.
It really does change how you look at things, doesn't it? Seeing the underlying landscape beneath the headlines.
It adds a whole different dimension. You start seeing connections you might have missed.
So, thinking about everything we've unpacked today, those deep geographical patterns, the mountains, rivers, coastlines, plains, the strategic locations, when you look at a map now or watch the news about conflicts or alliances,
How much of it, do you think, is really being driven by that ancient earth and stone, by the shape of the land itself laid down over millennia?
versus how much is about the immediate decisions, the ideologies, the leaders making choices right now? It's a fascinating tension, isn't it?
It really is. What does the map, read through this geographical lens, tell you about where things might be heading?
Something definitely worth pondering. We hope this deep dive has given you some valuable insights into these powerful, often hidden forces shaping our world.
And maybe made you look at the next map you see a little differently.
Join us next time as we dive deep into another fascinating set of ideas.